Hey everyone, this is Brandon Rush. Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Agent Investor. The goal of The Agent Investor is for me to have conversations with those who are in the commercial real estate space and multifamily space to help you as our audience make informed decisions in your everyday business. Today we have a good friend of mine, Brandon Carroll. He is a senior manager for a global finance and business consulting company. He's based out of Fairfield County. How are you doing today, Brandon?
I'm doing awesome, Brandon. I appreciate you having me on. This is exciting and happy to dive into it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brandon and I met, I'm trying to think, maybe it was at a REFA event or a
You're right.
local real
Yeah.
estate event somewhere. Yeah, a few months back, and we kind of stayed in touch. And I thought what he did was good stuff and would be definitely helpful to our audience. So I figured I'd bring him on, let him speak a bit about his offerings and about some of these programs that we're going to talk about. And yeah, we'll go from there. So without further ado, let's get to it. So Brandon, tell us about yourself. How are you involved in commercial real estate?
So in commercial real estate, the firm I'm at, we do a lot of tax incentives, funding programs all over the country, all over the world. In the US, there are specific energy efficiency incentives on a federal level for both commercial and residential. And when I say residential, it could be single family all the way up to a high rise apartment complex. And those incentives are what we help owners, operators, developers, investors. We help them leverage those incentives so they can reduce their tax bill, free up cash flow. And so that's how I'm involved in commercial real estate.
Very good. And you said keyword there. So when you say residential, residential is truly residential, meaning like a building of residences. And it doesn't mean 1 to 4 unit. It means just a building that's residential by nature.
Yep. We do now, while someone who has their own house or a developer who builds a house could leverage this incentive, we find that the best kind of ROI is someone, at least for the single family stuff, is for people that are building a community, right? Maybe a 20 home subdivision or 100 homes. Like that's where you can really tap into the weight of these tax credits. Townhomes are good. And then for multifamily, we usually look for 10 or 20 units and up. And that's where it is a dollar value per unit. So
Got it.
you really see it magnified when you have multiple units or multiple dwellings.
Got it. And those larger multifamilies for these programs is considered residential.
Correct. Yep.
Got it.
And
Okay.
there's some cool caveats, which we can go into a little bit later. So yeah, residential is single family all the way up to your skyscraper residential building in Manhattan.
Got it. No, very good. All right. So let's get into some questions so folks know what we're talking about here. So let's see. Tell us a little bit more about the basics of the 179D Energy Efficiency Commercial Tax Deduction and also the 45L Residential Home Tax Credit. A lot of words, but I'll let you explain it.
Yeah, and I don't have to get too into the weeds here. It's very much like you said it, right? One is for commercial buildings and one is for residential. The residential one, 45L, is a tax credit, right? For those of you who don't know, tax credit is a dollar for dollar reduction in someone's tax bill. So if I'm a
Got it.
business, I owe $100,000 and I have a $50,000 tax credit. I just cut my tax bill in half. Now, a tax deduction, which is for 179D, that's the commercial energy efficiency incentives. That is a deduction you want to think about is kind of like an expense. It's a deduction. And for every dollar you expense, that equates to, roughly about 30 cents off your tax bill, right? So I have a $100,000 deduction. It's about 30 grand potentially off my tax bill as a business. So that's how they differ a little bit. They are energy efficiency incentives. These are federal programs that got about a 2.5x multiplier through the Inflation Reduction Act last year. So they've gone through a lot of, the journey that these things have gone through. They've been on the chopping block every 2 years and they've finally been instituted as more of a permanent type of incentive. And then they got really big kicks, shots to the arm last year. And so they revolve around three main pillars when you think about both. And you want to think about building envelope. So what is that? That's the windows, that's the insulation, it's the roof. And then comes HVAC, so the heating and cooling system, and then lighting. And so those three categories are really, when you think about it, the big drivers and how a building consumes energy. So the whole point of these programs is to incentivize builders, designers, developers to build buildings that consume less energy. And the idea is that these incentives will help ideally offset the cost of these systems. Because some of these systems, because they're newer, they're more efficient, sometimes they come with a higher price tag. So the whole point is to try to alleviate that financial burden by offsetting that, maybe even and some. And ideally, you're freeing up some cash flow so you can make your next investment or whatever you want to do, whether it's hire more employees and things like that. And so that's kind of how they work. And like I said, one is a deduction for commercial buildings and one is a credit for residential, meaning single family all the way up to multifamily, multi-unit apartment complexes.
Got it, got it. So, kind of going off the script here from our questions that we had, what's an example of how someone would utilize this program? And I give an example. I'm a developer, commercial developer. I'm developing an office building in downtown Hartford, and I would like to basically save on taxes through credits or, tax deductible credits through maybe your company, or what would that look like?
Sure. So these incentives they can be used when you finish, when you get your COO, right? Your certificate of occupancy. That is a green light to say, great, building's ready. Now I can start to cash in on all the different incentives and tax tools that are available. And so if I finish my building, let's just say it's a 100-unit residential rental property, right? I finish it, start to rent out the units. So I can do 45L on that. We want to look at how many stories it is. But once it's finished, you can do 45L on that. You can also do 179D on it. That's the one kind of cool thing about buildings that are 4 stories or more for residential. You can do the residential 45L credit, and you can also do 179D. Whereas if it's a commercial office space, you can only do 179D. So there are some pretty cool things to doing multi-unit residential. And so how you'd actually cash in on those is you would talk to someone like me, engage a firm who's got experience and understanding around the space. And there's 2 big things that have to happen. One is you have to do the energy modeling. And so we have to model out the energy usage and consumption of the building through different drawings and schematics that we gather from the clients. We have to use IRS approved software, energy modeling software. And if that gives us the readings and the output that say, yes, this is going to, give you some type of benefit, we confirm with the client that this benefit's going to help them. And the final thing that we have to do is a field inspection. So we have to go on site and verify that all the stuff that was there on paper that we use to model is actually physically there. And then a professional engineer has to inspect that, sign off on it, and then we deliver that report with the credit calculations or deduction calculations. We deliver that to the client, who then puts that to their accountant or CPA, who files that on their annual tax returns. And this is per building. So let's say you're a developer and you finish 3 projects this year. So those 3 projects are going to be 3 claims for each building that are going to go on your tax return. And that's kind of how it would work. And a lot of times what happens is if you've been in the business for a while, you've been doing this, you have the ability to go back 3 years, 5 years, 7 years on property that you haven't done this for. So that's kind of the exciting part for people who haven't done this, is there might be money sitting there on the table. Like the work's already done. So it's just a matter of finding a firm that knows what they're doing. You have to be a licensed. The IRS requires that you outsource to a third-party professional engineer. And so this is why we pair nicely with accounting firms and things like that. And we employ these professional engineers in-house. They're scattered around the country so that we can do field inspections. And then we also pair those folks with financial analysts and CPAs so that we can understand the financial part of it and do the calculation correctly.
Got it. And question, so it sounds like it's really based off the energy footprint that a building has in place post renovation or post development that determines the level of, not return, but the level of credit that they can get in the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's new builds and renovations. And when it comes to the renovation, it gets a little more scrutinized, right? Like how far are you going into the renovation? If you're just doing cosmetics, sometimes it's not really worth it, or you might not be touching the stuff that really moves the needle. New builds are always the best because usually the documents are readily available and there's things like that. I will say also, so this is meant for people that own the building. So for 179D, you have to own the property and you have to have developed it or been responsible for the renovation. For 45L, you have to have developed it or be responsible for the renovation. But if you sold it, because you still are the one that developed it or renovated, you have 3 years. This is the statute of limitations within a tax credit. You have 3 years to go back and claim the credit for that building that you built. So that's a little bit how they differ, right? So, and that's why it's cool if I'm a residential developer and I put up 100 homes in a community in some, suburban area, and I did that 2 years ago, I can amend my tax return from
Mm.
2021, and actually the
Yeah.
IRS will cut me a check for all those houses I put up. Same thing with multifamily. If I developed 3 multifamily buildings last year, I can amend my 2022 tax returns, get cash for that. Whereas
Yeah.
179, you have to be the current owner. And if I sell my building and someone buys it, they can't really do it unless they do a significant renovation, because it's there for the people responsible for
Sure.
implementing the new energy efficient systems. So that's
Got
really
it.
the big thing that people have to understand. It's when a building trades hands, you might do cost segregation. And that's also a good indicator of whether someone should leverage these types of incentives. If they're doing
Mm.
cost seg, that's a good indicator that people should be doing these. But these energy incentives are really for the folks that are responsible for building or renovating with these energy efficiency systems in mind.
Got it. Got it. Very good. So moving on to the next question. What are some of the common misconceptions that real estate professionals or developers may have about these energy efficiency tax incentives?
Sure, there's a few of them out there. I think what I see a lot are folks that think that they can do this in house,
Mm.
even if they have a professional engineer. They can't. It's illegal. The tax code
Mm.
says we want a third party professional engineer, a PE, licensed engineer. So it can't just be an engineer. PE is another level. You have to take a test. You have to be licensed in the states that you're practicing in. And they do that so you can have an unbiased opinion, right? It's kind of like if, Apple's not going to do their own taxes, right? They have to get an accounting firm to do their
Yeah.
taxes, right? It's
Yeah.
the same idea. You have to have an unbiased person come in there who's going to give it a fair assessment and actually use the standards put forth by the tax code. So that's a common misconception. And I would say another one might be that some people think there's like, oh, this is a big audit risk. I don't want to do this because I might get audited or something like that. Well, I think with any tax comes risk, right? You
Yeah.
could get audited without filing any taxes. There's always some chance. But what's the reality is that these incentives wouldn't have been put in place unless they were supposed to be taken advantage of, right? These are new and shiny and worth more. And the whole point of them being there is so that you can make buildings use less energy. And
Mm.
so if you're doing that, you're kind of selling yourself short if you're not tapping into everything that's built around you. What's more important is that you work with someone who knows what they're doing, who's doing it accurately and following the rules. So that if in a low probability chance that someone questions it, you can stand up
Yep.
with confidence and say, I did everything correctly. I will say one thing that's nice about some of the services that we provide is audit defense is baked into every single engagement that we do. So we approach everything assuming there will be one, even though the chance is very low. But
Yep.
with that in mind, the rules, the standards, everything is by the book. And we always lean more on the conservative side. And we don't want to bend the rules. We're not trying to get our wrist slapped or anything. We'd rather be known for doing it the right way, accurately. And so sometimes that's a common misconception. A third misconception, I think for 45L, there's been a lot of gray area on the new standards of how you maximize the benefit. And I haven't really put any numbers to these things. We can get into that before we wrap up. And so some people might just get spooked off because there's not a lot of concrete, at the end of the day, some of this stuff is open to interpretation. And so you
Yep.
need tax professionals that understand tax law, court cases, historical legislation. You need those people who understand those things, those trends, so that if they're in a gray area, they can make a pretty good determination of how to interpret the code, what do these words mean, and how do we put this into practice. And so I would say that's a third thing, is just really kind of understanding how to read between the lines. Not everything is always black and white with
Yeah.
legislation updates. And so it's really important that you lean on the right people to understand the history and what the law is really trying to tell you.
Got it. And kind of tagging on to that, I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate, and I'm thinking through why wouldn't a developer or an investor utilize this program if they develop in a community or they are building a large office facilities or whatever it may be. Even, I'm assuming industrial account as well, depending on the facility. So why wouldn't someone use this program? Is it a lot of it may be just misunderstanding, or are a lot of people are a lot of developers actually using this program, or do you see a lot of developers not using it?
No, I'm really glad you brought this up because it
Yeah,
opens up a whole different aspect of how these things can be utilized or why they wouldn't be utilized. I
yeah,
think the biggest thing that we can run into sometimes is even though there's a developer on the project, they might be a part of a much larger group. And every developer has to raise capital, right?
yep,
You're going to build something, it's going to cost $40 million. Where are you going to get the money? And so, depending on how many hands give you money, those are all limited partners and they have
mm,
equity in that project. So,
I see.
if I have $1 million benefit and I've got 5 hands in the project, that's not too bad. I only got to split it 5 ways. However, if I throw in some institutional money, I throw in a couple banks, and then I throw in like, 20 other investors because I only got like 100 grand at a time. Now I have 50 hands, maybe 100. I don't know. Institutional can mean thousands. When you have to split $1 million that many times, then it becomes almost cost prohibitive, or it's harder for people
Yeah,
to really see the benefits. Like, oh, I'm going to shave a grand off my tax bill. Whoop de doo. And so
yeah,
those are sometimes reasons why people will choose not to pursue those. I would say when there's more cooks in the kitchen, unless people are just, everyone's got a different opinion. A dollar saved is a dollar saved to some people. It's like, I don't
yeah,
care if it's a dollar, I don't care if it's $100, like whatever.
yeah,
And I meet those people all the time. And sometimes those are the groups saying like, we'll take everything we can get.
yeah.
Other groups are more like, if it's below this threshold, it doesn't matter. They only want to
Not
focus
worth
on the
that
big
time.
ticket stuff. Yeah. And so that's one of the big hurdles. The other thing I will say is historically, government entities, municipalities, whether it's federal, towns, states, those entities that own their buildings are by nature tax exempt, right? They don't pay taxes. So the question becomes, so if someone built their energy efficient structure, but they don't own the building, what happens with the benefit? It just kind of lives and just doesn't, no one just sitting
Mm,
there on the table. And so those government entities are able to allocate the benefit to the architect or the MEP engineer,
oh, nice. Yeah,
designer. So that's a way for those entities that really can't claim it because they can't use it, they can give it to those other parties that are responsible for actually designing the building. And what was a big update last year through the Inflation Reduction Act is they added nonprofits to that, which is
mm,
big. That's, you think about higher education, K through 12, you think about hospitals, all the other big nonprofit entities out there that are large companies that have buildings and projects and stuff like that. Now they can allocate the benefit to those types of designers as well, responsible for the buildings. And so those are probably the two reasons that you wouldn't claim the benefit. One, some groups of people can just allocate it to the other party. And then, unfortunately for those large groups of investor communities, it just doesn't make financial sense. Like a REIT, there's so many people involved in the investment
yeah,
of a REIT that a tax benefit just doesn't make sense. I'm still on the hunt to figure out how to make it work.
yeah,
Um, like if they could all sign something to like pool it back in and reinvest it somewhere as a group, maybe that would make
yeah.
sense. But I'll get in touch when I figure it out.
Yeah, no, that'd be good. I mean, those are definitely valid reasons would never thought of, but it makes complete sense. And I'm thinking for nonprofits and municipalities, if they can't take benefit from that tax credit or whatever it may be that's coming back to them, and they hand it off, I'm assuming that could lead to cheaper development costs for them because if the developer knows that they're going to get this credit at some point, they could build that into the build and potentially lower the build cost.
Yeah, I get in discussions with like that, like a lot. You can use it in so many ways, right? You can pitch it as a means to lowering the cost of your services.
Hmm.
You can pitch it as freeing up cash on the back end to reinvest into something else. But I think that's probably the most attractive thing. I was talking to a commercial HVAC designer and installer the other week, and they want to use this as a really good thing to mention to their companies. Hey, you're going to spend $1 million
Yep.
putting this new HVAC system in. We're going to charge you, I don't know, 100 grand to do it. Look at this benefit here, this incentive that can make a huge dent in our invoice. And there you
Hmm.
go. Now it's lowered the cost of seeking out and paying for maybe what an expensive energy efficient HVAC system, but it's lowering the cost of that. And so that's a really good example. I think that's a common way to look at it is like it's going to lower the cost of the materials and the cost of the project.
Absolutely. No, very good. All right. So moving on. So can you share an example, maybe a recent example, a past example of maybe a client or a company that's utilized this program? You don't have to mention names, and just how it benefited them, or what the outcome was.
Sure. Something that comes to mind that happened last week, and it just goes to show the value of making sure that we do a thorough process. On paper, they had the systems that they had installed. We did the energy modeling. It was just barely enough to make sense. And so they said, okay, fine, let's do the field inspection. Let's do it. This was a 200,000 foot office building that had just gone up. So what they thought they were going to get $5 per square foot. So 179D, you can get a max of $5 per square foot now. So you can do the math on a 200,000 square foot building, you're talking $1 million. So they were going to come into about $1 per square foot, which, they still said, let's go for it. So after the field inspection, we realized that there was an error on the drawings and some of the documents that they had given us. And what was in fact installed met the criteria that they needed to hit the $5 per square foot. So it just goes to show it's really important. The devil's in the details, and the person inspecting needs to know what they're doing and be very well informed on all different aspects of a building and the systems that run it, because they identified the HVAC unit right away and they said that wasn't what's on the piece of paper. This is nicer and it's hitting all these other specs. And we were able to re-up our findings, and the client was very happy because it was a much bigger deduction.
Absolutely. Oh, very good. All right. So we got one more question in terms of the programs here. How would these programs benefit property owners and developers, maybe more so property owners, in terms of property values long term?
Yeah, it's a good idea. Good question. So going to the residential side, the big thing for upgrades in the Inflation Reduction Act of 45L used to be $2,000 per unit. Now it's $5,000. It's a big jump. To get the $5,000, you have to do two things, and they each are equally valuable, right? So one's $2,500, the other one's $2,500 as well. One's easier to meet, one's a little harder. The easier one to meet is Energy Star certification. So if you want to get $2,500 a unit, you have to be Energy Star certified, which we do. We are a licensed Energy Star certification house. We'll also tell you how to do it. But what's bigger than that is on an MLS, historically and into the future, you get to tell buyers and all viewers that you are an Energy Star certified property. And historically, those properties have always held a higher value than a property with similar specs sitting right next to it without Energy Star. It's just viewed in the buyer's mindset that this is a more valuable building. They know that their energy bills are going to be lower. It's more valuable long term. And so that's just one thing to think about. The other piece of the pie for the other $2,500 is a zero energy ready home. That's a little harder to hit. You hear passive house, you hear other things being thrown around. We advise on both of those, but that's something to think about as far as, long-term value and what you're doing. If you're doing multifamily, Energy Star can go a long way. And that's what the IRS has subscribed to, not only to get the credit, but you have to do it in order to get the credit. And it also makes you look great in the marketplace.
Sure, absolutely. All right. All good content, super good stuff. I'm sure our audience is going to be able to take back and digest and apply to some of their business models moving forward. So let's kind of dive into some personal questions as we start to wrap up here. First off, when you're not doing your energy, well, you work for a larger firm, but when you're not doing your business, what do you enjoy doing in your personal time?
That's a good question. I moved down from Boston with my family to Connecticut. You said I was in Fairfield County. So I'm keeping myself busy with this house. It's just cosmetic stuff, but man, there's a lot of projects. And so that's been fun. And, I can up my handyman skills. I've got 2 kids, a boy and a girl, with a third on the way. So that keeps me really busy. Just making sure I can let loose a little bit, spend time with family. That's really important. I'm a musician on the side, so I do love to play music, guitar and piano, and get out and stay active when I can. And as far as side hustles, I have a little publishing thing going on where I'm just trying to write some books and be a little more active in the socials. A lot of times for this information too, I think it's hard to find this information. And so to give people bite-sized chunks of how they can learn a little bit and where they can go to access that information, that's important to me too.
Absolutely. Very good. So how can people find you? How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Yes, you can go on LinkedIn, search Brandon Carroll. I think it's Brandon Carroll 510 actually is my handle.
And I'll link it in as well.
Yeah, so you'll link it in there. I'm on Instagram on 1-800-BRANDON. You can find me on email, just bcarroll@layton.com, and you can post all my contact info. I will stress that with the updates in legislation, because these things are so valuable, these incentives, we've seen a lot of funny little small shops come out of the woodworks. I would just advise people to make sure that they're working with someone with a long history of experience and success who really knows what they're talking about. With a lot of money comes a lot of claims, comes more scrutiny. We saw it happen with employee retention credits. We'll see a lot more of these energy efficient claims. You shouldn't be scared to do it. You should just want to make sure that you're really confident with who you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. And last question for you. Any final words for our audience before we take off?
Final words, I would just say what I just talked about is just the tip of the iceberg. In 2025, a lot more incentives open up, and a lot of them are attached to real estate. So all the more reason to get in touch, learn about all of them. If you have a project going on right now, if it comes into service in 2025, there's likely not just what I talked about, but even more things to cash in on whether you're investing in solar for your roof or whether you're producing different types of electricity, clean electricity. There's a lot of different things out there. So seek out some advice. And the IRS doesn't have a marketing agency.
Yeah.
So it's not like these things are staring you in the face. So go find them and leverage them. It's really important. It's your money. You worked hard for it. It's a way to climb the ladder quicker, but the smart way, because these are there to help you not cut into your business revenue.
Got it. Absolutely. So it sounds like you and your company could be a good resource for anybody that has a new development in the queue. And just call you. And even if it's not this program, just asking, hey, this is what I'm doing. I'm just throwing it out there. Let me know what's possible. And then just never know.
I don't charge for any of that. And if I don't do it, I might know someone who can. And so I would encourage anyone to call, text, email, message me on the socials, whatever it is. I'm happy to be a resource and point you in the right direction. If it's not to us, I'm sure I know someone who can. And like you said, we can help with a lot of this stuff. And we've built a pretty A-class team that has a lot of experience in the industry.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So we are fully wrapped up here. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today. To our audience, as always, thank you all for joining us for another episode of The Agent Investor. We wish you the best in your health and happiness. And until next time, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks again, Brandon. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Brandon.